Hello everyone, this is Andrew from Crown Academy of English. Today's lesson is about the difference between who and whom. So who and whom are pronouns that refer to people. So in this lesson you will learn the use of who and whom in questions and in relative clauses. And you will also learn the position of prepositions with who and whom. However, very important, before I start this lesson, you must understand that in practice, so in reality, whom with an M is not used very often. In modern English, we often replace whom with who. Okay? But it is important for you to know what this means. It is important for you to know the official grammar rule for whom. But then you must understand that in reality, it is not very common. Okay? So let's start. Who and whom in questions. So who acts as the subject of a question. The subject of a question. Example. Who kicked you? Who kicked you? So who is the subject, kicked is the verb, and you is the object. Easy, okay? Now, whom acts as the object of a question, the object. So it's the opposite. Whom did you kick? Whom did you kick? So now, whom is the object of the question. You is now the subject of the question. So the subject, remember, this is the person doing the action, doing the kicking. And kick is the verb. Okay? So, whom is always the object, and who is the subject. Okay? But remember what I said at the beginning of the lesson. The use of whom is very old and formal. It's not very common. So what do? Well, we also use who as the object of a question. Okay, so we replace whom with who. So in modern English, we say, who did you kick? So we do not say, whom did you kick? Because this is old and formal. We prefer, who did you kick? So basically, who can act as the subject or the object in modern English. Okay? So if you see whom or you hear whom, then you know that it is quite formal. Okay? It's quite formal. So this is the object, this is the subject, this is the verb. Okay? So this is why this is why it causes so much confusion to English students, because it is not very common, so people wonder, don't really understand it. Okay? Now let's look at some more examples in questions. So remember, who acts as the subject? Who wrote these reports? So we have the subject, verb, and reports is the object. Who is using my computer? Who is the subject? Is using is the verb. My computer is the object. Easy. Reminder, whom acts as the object of a question in old, very formal English. Whom did you call? Whom did you call? Subject, verb, object. But remember, we don't really say this in modern English. In modern English, who acts as the object of a question. Who did you call? Okay, so subject, verb, object. Subject, verb, object. Okay. Now let's look at relative clauses. So first of all, let's look at who. So let's look at a normal sentence without any relative clauses. So this is just a normal sentence. The customer was angry. So this is just the normal main sentence. Now let's add some extra information. Let's make a complex sentence. So let's add a relative clause. The customer who called me was angry. Who called me is the relative clause. Okay? And within the relative clause, the word who is referring to the customer, and it is the subject of the relative clause. So who is the subject of the relative clause. So who is referring to the customer, and who is the subject of this. So we have the subject. So the subject is who, and who is referring to the customer. So the customer is also the subject. So we have the subject, verb, and the object of the relative clause. So this is the important bit. Who, we use who in a relative clause as the subject. That's the thing that you need to remember. So in terms of grammar and parts of speech, who is a relative pronoun. Okay, so in this context, who is a relative pronoun, and it is the subject of the relative clause. Okay, so now let's look at whom in relative clauses. Let's start with the same sentence, just a normal sentence, no clauses. So this is just a normal sentence. Now let's add another relative clause. The customer whom I called was angry. Whom I called was angry. So whom I called is the relative clause. And the word whom is also referring to the customer. Okay, so whom is representing or referring to the customer. And it is the object of the relative clause. So whom is the object of this part in red. So this is the object, and whom is referring to the customer. So whom is the object of the relative clause. I is the subject, and called is the verb. So I called the customer, and the customer is angry. So that's the meaning of the sentence. I am the person calling. I am the person doing the action. Okay, this is the object. And whom, in terms of grammar and parts of speech, is called the relative pronoun. And more specifically, it is the object of the relative clause. So that is the other way that we use whom, as part of a relative clause, and it is the object. But remember, this is not very common in modern English. So, in modern English, we don't really use whom. We replace it with who. So we say, instead of saying this, we usually say, the customer who I called was angry. So who now becomes, yes, the object of the relative clause in modern everyday English. Okay, but it's still important that you know the real official grammar rule. Okay, so it's important to know this, but then to realize that it is not very common. Let's look at some more examples of relative clauses. Reminder, who is a subject relative pronoun. The woman who cuts Mark's hair is Italian. The woman who cuts Mark's hair is Italian. So who cuts Mark's hair is the relative clause, and who is the relative pronoun, and it is the subject because it's who cuts. It's the subject of the verb cut, and Mark's hair is the object. Okay, easy. Reminder, whom acts as an object relative pronoun in old and formal English. The girl whom I met yesterday has invited me for a drink. So whom is the relative object relative pronoun, and whom I met yesterday is the relative clause. Okay, so within the clause, I is the subject, met is the verb, and whom is representing the object, the girl. Okay, I met the girl yesterday, and she has invited me for a drink. Okay? But remember, this is only really used in very traditional, formal English. It's not very common in everyday English. In modern English, we prefer who as an object relative pronoun. So we say, the girl who I met yesterday has invited me for a drink. Who, W-H-O. Okay? So I hope that is clear for you for relative clauses. Now, advanced rule. The relative pronoun is optional when it is the object of the clause. So it's optional means that it is not compulsory. Sometimes we can choose not to use it. So let's look at an example of when we use it. So it is optional when it is the object of the clause. So in formal English, we can say this: the customer whom I called was angry. We've already seen this example. So we can choose, it's optional, so we have chosen to use it. In modern English, we use who. And when it is the object, like here, it is optional. And here we have chosen to use it. So this is correct. The customer who I called was angry. This is correct in modern English. But since it is optional, we can choose not to use this relative pronoun. So we can write this: the customer I called was angry. And that is perfectly correct. Okay? So we don't write or say the relative pronoun. It's optional. Okay? Only when it is the object of the clause. That's very important. Only when it is the object. The relative pronoun is not optional when it is the subject of the clause. So this means that the relative pronoun is compulsory. We must use the relative pronoun when it is the subject of the clause. We cannot omit it. We cannot miss it out. So remember, we always use who as the subject of the clause. So we write this: the customer who called me was angry. So this is correct. But this is wrong. Here we have not used the relative pronoun, and it is wrong. Okay? Because it is not optional when it is the subject of the clause. Okay, so this is quite an advanced rule, but it is important. Now, what do we do with prepositions? What is the position of prepositions with who and whom? So that's the question. We have two choices. So choice one, this is very formal. So when we have a preposition, then we have this form. We have the preposition immediately followed by whom. Okay? Example. I like the people with whom I work. I like the people with whom I work. So with is the preposition, and it's immediately followed by the object, which is the object of the preposition, which is whom. Okay, with whom I work. Okay. Another example. To whom did he give the money? To whom did he give the money? So we have the preposition to, immediately followed by whom. Okay. Did he give the money? Question. And so this is the object of a preposition. Remember, a preposition is always followed by a noun or pronoun, and it is the object of that preposition. And since whom is always the object, we use whom. But again, this is formal language. It's not very common. So in modern everyday English, we prefer choice number 2. So in choice number 2, we don't use whom, we prefer who. So in choice number 2, we use who, and we put the preposition right at the end of the sentence. Okay, so it goes right at the end. So let's look at these two examples using choice number 2. I like the people who I work with. Who I work with. So we use who, and we put the preposition at the end of the sentence. Okay, so here we have the subject, verb, the preposition, and the object of the preposition actually goes before it. So it's quite a strange order of words, but this is how we say it in modern English. Okay. And the other example, using choice 2, modern English. So we use who, and the preposition goes right at the end. Who did he give the money to? Who did he give the money to? So we have who, and then did he give the money to? So he is the subject, give is the verb. Here we have the preposition right at the end of the sentence, and we have the object of the preposition here at the beginning. Okay, so those are the two choices that you have with the prepositions and who or whom. Okay, so there we are. Don't forget to check out our website. Lots of useful stuff on there, including an IELTS training course. And here are some other videos which I think you'll be interested in.